Father David here. It's Sunday and time for your weekly sermon. And this week, the sermon is based on the reading from Luke's Gospel that introduces us to John the Baptist, that fiery prophet who opens the New Testament for us. And the title of this sermon is, fittingly, Prophets. When we hear the story of John the Baptist, how often do we think of him as little more than a historical figure, a relic of the past, that John existed as a real person and not some fictional character? Well, that's well established. Not only does he play a crucial role in all four Gospels, but Josephus, the Jewish historian who wrote volumes about first century Israel, comments on the ministry of John. And while I'm usually the first to rebel when sermons turn into history lessons, let's eavesdrop just for a moment on what this non-Christian historian wrote about John way back around 90 AD, because it ties in with where we're going with our gospel lesson today. And I quote, "Now some of the Jews thought that the destruction of Herod's army came from God as a just punishment for what Herod had done against John, who was called the Baptist. For Herod had killed this good man, who had commanded the Jews to exercise virtue and righteousness toward one another and piety toward God. Now many people came in crowds for him, for they were greatly moved by his words. Herod, who feared the great influence John had over the masses, that it might put him into his power and enable him to raise a rebellion, for they seemed to be ready to do anything he should advise. Herod thought it best to put him to death. In this way he might prevent any mischief John might cause. Accordingly, John was sent as a prisoner out of Herod's suspicious temper to Machaerus, the castle, and was put to death." End of quote. Well, why does John's historical existence matter? Perhaps because of our oh-so-human tendency to find a million ways to privatize, individualize, and spiritualize our faith, which is a handy-dandy way to separate what we believe from how we live. And for most of us, confronting this dilemma becomes the central challenge of our lives. How do we actually live out this strange faith that makes so many demands on us? Not the usual culturally conditioned demands of what a spiritual person ought to look like making a good impression in polite society, or not swearing or drinking too much, or being obsessed with other people's private sexual lives. No, the hard demands of our faith require a lot more from us. We're challenged to dig deep and forgive. We're encouraged to be generous, not just out of our abundance, but out of our need as well. We're instructed to extend mercy, even when it's not deserved. And how often do we not even try to do these things because we're convinced it's simply impossible? Which is why it matters that people like John actually lived in this world and did their best to live out the difficult demands of our faith, because prophets didn't die out with John's generation. Prophets arise in every generation. And frankly, as Christians, we are all, to one extent or another, called to take up the task of being a prophet in this world. To be sure, it's a task that falls with greater weight on the clergy, because what's the point of wearing this collar if we're afraid to be led toward places of risk, if we're afraid to stand with the truth tellers? But prophecy is also a task for the entire priesthood of believers. To be a prophet is to be a witness to God's truth in this world, a truth rooted in forgiveness, mercy, and compassion, to be sure, but also a truth rooted in justice, equity, and human dignity, in service to the least, the lost, and the left behind. There is a wonderful method to this madness, because when we actually live out our faith, when we become the hands and feet of Christ, we become connected to the source of all that is. It is from that precious flow of life that joy is born. Remember Archbishop Desmond Tutu? He died a few years ago, and like a number of people here in Hawaii, I got to meet him when he visited our cathedral several years ago. And frankly, you can hardly think of a less likely prophet for our times. Small in stature, the product of an apartheid terrorism, he went on to become a beacon that shined gospel hope throughout the world. He fearlessly advocated for human dignity and equality, and he made regular forays into the midst of riots and violence, urging peace. And through it all, he laughed, especially at himself. All of this formed the man who would then serve as the chair of South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Commission, a commission that helped steer South Africa away from civil war and toward interracial cooperation based on mutual respect, atonement, and forgiveness. This beloved Archbishop was one of many called to be a testament to the power of God moving in our times and in our communities. Well, how might we honor that legacy? Perhaps not merely with lip service to racial justice and reconciliation, but with lives actually dedicated to that work. We do this by learning to live together as children and family of God, no longer hurting each other, no longer hurting God's creation, but together living the dream that God intended. For in God's dream, as the Hebrew prophet Isaiah said, "They will not hurt or destroy on my holy mountain, for the earth will be full of the knowledge of the Lord as the waters cover the sea." And so the question our gospel lesson asks us today, the question of the legacy of Archbishop Tutu, is this: where might we, as today's prophets, be called to lift up our voices? Well, the answers are legion. Can we, in the face of so much right-wing nonsense, stand up for diversity, inclusion, and equity training that seeks to reverse centuries of inequities committed against minorities and women? Can we have the courage to address our abhorrent history of chattel slavery and study the systematic exclusion of African Americans from full participation in our body politic for far too long? Can we stand up against the lies about immigrants and those who are different from the norm? As housing prices skyrocket and many of our elderly live in homes that are house rich but cash poor, have you seen the food bank lines in some of our even wealthier neighborhoods, while our younger people cannot afford to buy a home? Who among us are called to use their expertise and analysis to pester lawmakers who can make changes necessary to increase the supply of housing, to tax absentee owners, to otherwise move toward a more equitable society? We need to focus on these questions as we prepare in just a few days to reinstall the insurrectionist in chief, who will again resume the awesome powers of the presidency with renewed promises to undo the American experiment. Who among us shall be a voice for fairness, decency, and full participation of all people in our government? In response to these questions, perhaps you're wondering, what's this have to do with our faith? Shouldn't faith and politics be separate? And the answer, of course, is no. The life of the prophets, the life of Jesus, was never about minding our P's and Q's so that we could sneak into heaven or be greeted there by a brass band. Their life was about helping us to make this life better, serene, joy-filled, and just, which can happen, but only when we are in right relation with one another and with God. And that right relation begins with how we have structured our society, which these days gives much to the few and takes much from the many. It means finding ways to talk out our differences rather than fighting them out. It means a willingness to admit, I may be wrong, to be open, to change my mind. This is the legacy that the prophets leave for us. Shall we pick up their mantle? God bless you all.